Something just happened in the world, and if you blinked, you might have missed how serious it really is. Because in a move that sent shockwaves across global markets, military command centers, and energy corridors, Iran made a decision that many analysts once called unthinkable. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. Yes, that Strait of Hormuz, the narrow artery through which nearly 20% of the world's oil supply flows every single day, the choke point that global economies depend on, the pressure valve of the entire energy market. And just like that, it was shut. Now pause for a second. Think about what that means. Oil tankers stranded, energy prices instantly under pressure, insurance markets panicking, governments scrambling behind closed doors. But here is where the story takes a turn, because while the world was still trying to process Iran's move, while analysts were debating whether this was a bluff, a temporary escalation, or the beginning of something much bigger, the United States made a move, not the move people expected, not a full-scale military strike, not an immediate escalation, not the kind of response that headlines are usually built around. No, what the US did instead caught almost everyone off guard. And that is exactly why this moment matters. Because this is no longer just about a waterway. It's no longer just about oil. It's no longer even just about Iran. This is about power. It's about control over global systems. It's about who sets the rules and who breaks them. And more importantly, it's about what happens when those rules stop working. Let me say that again. What happens when the rules stop working? Because for decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been one of those unwritten red lines, a place where tension exists, but escalation is carefully managed, a place where threats are made, but rarely acted upon, until now. So the question is no longer, did Iran really do this? The question is, why now? Why take a step that risks triggering a global economic shock? Why challenge a system that the world's most powerful nations depend on? And most importantly, what did the United States see coming that made it respond in a way no one predicted? Because make no mistake, this isn't just another headline. This is the beginning of something bigger. And if you want to understand where this is going, you have to understand what just happened. In the early hours, reports began surfacing that Iranian naval forces, primarily units linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, had moved aggressively into key positions along the Strait of Hormuz. Fast attack boats, anti-ship missile batteries along the coastline, naval mines reportedly deployed in critical shipping lanes. And then came the confirmation. Commercial shipping traffic slowed, then stopped. Several major tanker operators rerouted immediately. Others held position, waiting for clarity. Insurance premiums for vessels passing through the region surged within hours, some estimates suggesting increases of over 300%. Let that sink in. Within hours, the cost of moving oil through one of the most important choke points on Earth had skyrocketed. Now, Iran didn't just wake up one day and decide to do this. This move came after weeks, actually months, of rising tension, economic pressure, sanctions tightening, diplomatic signals breaking down. Officials in Iran had repeatedly warned that if their ability to export oil was restricted, they would respond by restricting everyone else's. And this was that response. But here's where things get more precise. Iran didn't announce a permanent closure. No, they framed it differently. They called it a defensive security measure. Think about that wording for a second. A defensive move that disrupts nearly 1/5 of global oil supply. A security measure that sends shockwaves through every major economy on the planet. That language wasn't accidental. It was calculated. It was designed to create ambiguity, to leave just enough room for de-escalation, while still demonstrating power. And at the same time, Iranian state media began broadcasting images, carefully selected, highly controlled, showing naval patrols, missile systems, and commanders issuing statements about protecting national sovereignty. But here is the part nobody is talking about. The speed, the coordination, the preparation. This wasn't improvised. You don't deploy naval assets, position missile batteries, and control maritime traffic in a matter of hours without planning. This was rehearsed. This was anticipated. And that raises a critical question. If Iran was preparing for this, who else knew? Because intelligence agencies across the world, especially in the United States, monitor this region constantly. Satellites, surveillance aircraft, naval patrols. It is one of the most watched stretches of water on Earth. So did they see this coming, or did they choose not to act, at least not immediately? Because here is where things get even more interesting. As the situation unfolded, as oil markets reacted, as global leaders began issuing cautious statements, the United States did not respond the way most people expected. There were no immediate airstrikes, no dramatic military escalation, no sudden deployment announcements dominating the headlines. Instead, there was silence. Measured, controlled, strategic silence. And then, quietly, something started to shift. Movements that weren't announced in press conferences, decisions that didn't make front-page news, at least not right away, actions that suggested the US wasn't reacting emotionally, it was executing a plan. Think about that for a second. While everyone else was reacting to Iran's move, the United States may have already been several steps ahead. And that changes everything. Because if this wasn't just a reaction, then what we're looking at isn't chaos, it's strategy. And once you start looking at it that way, this is global, this is systemic, and the consequences ripple far beyond the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. Start with the obvious: energy. Roughly 17 to 20 million barrels of oil per day pass through that narrow corridor. That's not just a number, that's the lifeline of major economies. Countries across Asia, Europe, and beyond depend on that steady flow to keep their industries running, their transportation systems moving, and their populations stable. So when that flow is disrupted, even partially, you don't just get higher oil prices, you get shockwaves. Within hours of the closure, futures markets began reacting. Traders started pricing in risk, supply chains recalibrated, and governments began preparing contingency plans. Because here's the reality: when oil spikes, everything spikes. Transportation costs go up, food prices follow, manufacturing slows, inflation rises. Think about that for a second. A decision made in one narrow waterway can affect the price of bread thousands of miles away. Let that sink in. And it doesn't stop there, because this isn't just about economics, it's about leverage. For decades, the global energy system has operated on a fragile understanding that critical routes like Hormuz remain open, even during periods of tension. That understanding has now been challenged. And when a system like that is challenged, it forces every major player to rethink their strategy. Countries like China, India, and Japan, all heavily dependent on energy imports, are suddenly faced with a difficult question. What happens if this disruption continues? Do they look for alternative routes, alternative suppliers, or do they step into the conflict diplomatically, or even strategically? Because here is where things get serious. Energy security is national security. And when energy security is threatened, nations don't just watch, they act. But here is the part nobody is talking about. This moment also exposes something deeper, something structural. The world has been moving toward a multipolar system. Multiple centers of power, competing interests, shifting alliances. And in that kind of system, choke points like Hormuz become more than just geographic locations. They become pressure points. Control over them means influence. Disruption of them means leverage. And Iran knows this. That's why this move isn't just symbolic, it's strategic. It sends a message, not just to the United States, but to the entire international system. A message that says, we have the ability to disrupt the status quo. Now ask yourself this: if one country can do this, what does that mean for global stability? What does that mean for markets that rely on predictability? What does that mean for alliances built on the assumption of open trade routes? Because once that assumption is broken, it's very hard to rebuild. And this is exactly why the response from the United States matters so much. Because Washington isn't just responding to Iran, it's responding to a challenge to the entire system it helped build. And that brings us to the most important question of all. How do you respond to a move like this without making the situation even worse? Do you escalate? Do you negotiate? Or do you do something unexpected? Because whatever the answer is, that answer will shape what happens next. The United States didn't follow the script. It rewrote it. Let me explain. In past crises, the playbook was predictable: a show of force, carrier strike groups moving into position, fighter jets deployed, statements about keeping sea lanes open, a visible buildup designed to deter or to prepare for confrontation. But this time, something different happened. Yes, there were movements, but not the kind that dominate headlines, not the kind that signal immediate retaliation. Instead, the US began shifting its posture in ways that were quieter, more calculated, and far more strategic. Naval assets already stationed in the region, particularly those connected to the United States Fifth Fleet, adjusted their positioning. Surveillance increased. Coordination with regional allies intensified. But here's the key point: there was no rush to strike, no immediate escalation, and that's exactly what made this move so unexpected. Because sometimes, the most powerful move is the one that doesn't look like a move at all. Think about that for a second. Instead of reacting emotionally, the US appeared to be expanding the battlefield, not physically, but strategically. Reports began to emerge, quietly at first, that Washington was engaging in rapid back-channel diplomacy, conversations with Gulf states, discussions with European allies, even indirect signals being sent through intermediaries. At the same time, something else started happening. Alternative supply routes. Energy corridors outside of Hormuz suddenly became a priority. Pipelines that bypassed the strait, shipping routes being reorganized, strategic reserves being evaluated for potential release. This wasn't just a military response, it was an economic one, a systemic one. Let that sink in. Instead of confronting Iran directly in the waterway it controls, the US began working to reduce the importance of that waterway itself. And that is a completely different kind of power move. Because if Hormuz is no longer the only option, then the leverage Iran is trying to use starts to weaken. But here is the part nobody is talking about. This kind of strategy doesn't produce immediate results. It takes time. And during that time, tension remains high, markets remain unstable, and the risk of miscalculation increases. So why take that risk? Why avoid a direct response? Why choose a slower, more complex strategy instead of a rapid show of force? Because maybe, just maybe, the goal isn't just to reopen the strait. Maybe the goal is to change the game entirely, to make sure that no single choke point, no single actor can hold the global system hostage again. Think about what that means. If successful, this wouldn't just resolve the current crisis. It would reshape global energy dynamics for years to come. But if it fails, the consequences could be severe. Because in a situation like this, patience can be a strength, but it can also be a risk. And as this strategy unfolds, the rest of the world is watching closely, waiting, calculating, trying to figure out what comes next. Because when a crisis like this unfolds, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads across markets, across governments, across entire populations. Within hours of the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, global oil markets reacted with volatility that traders haven't seen in years. Prices surged, dipped, then surged again as uncertainty took control. And uncertainty is the most dangerous force in global economics. Think about that for a second. Markets don't just respond to reality, they respond to expectations, to fear, to speculation about what might happen next. So when a critical artery like Hormuz is suddenly in question, the reaction isn't linear, it's explosive. Shipping companies began issuing alerts. Some halted operations entirely in the region. Others demanded massive risk premiums just to continue moving cargo. Insurance firms, those quiet, often overlooked players in global trade, started recalculating exposure. War risk insurance rates skyrocketed. And here's something most people don't realize. If insurance becomes too expensive, ships don't move. Let that sink in. You don't need a complete physical blockade to disrupt global trade. Financial pressure alone can slow everything down, and that is exactly what started happening. Meanwhile, governments across the world began responding, but not all in the same way. Leaders in China called for restraint and stability, emphasizing the need to keep energy flows uninterrupted. India started reviewing emergency energy reserves. Germany and other European nations held urgent consultations about supply security. Because here is the reality. Every major economy is now part of this story, whether they want to be or not. And then there's the political fallout. Inside the United States, debates intensified almost immediately. Some voices called for a stronger, more visible response. Others warned against escalation, arguing that a direct confrontation could spiral into something far worse. Sound familiar? It's the same divide that appears in every major geopolitical crisis: strength versus restraint, action versus strategy. But this time, the stakes feel different because this isn't just about regional influence. This is about the stability of global systems. And here's where things get even more complicated. Allies, countries in the Gulf region, those geographically closest to the crisis, found themselves in an incredibly delicate position. On one hand, they rely on security guarantees from Washington. On the other hand, they share proximity, and in some cases economic ties, with Iran. So what do? Do they align fully with the US response? Do they push for de-escalation? Or do they try to balance both, without provoking either side? Think about how difficult that is. Because in moments like this, neutrality becomes almost impossible. And then, there's public perception. Across social media, news outlets, and public discourse, narratives began to form. Some framed Iran's move as a defensive reaction to pressure. Others saw it as a dangerous escalation that threatens global stability. And those narratives matter because they shape how governments justify their actions. They influence policy decisions. They affect how long a crisis lasts and how it ends. Let that sink in. This isn't just a physical conflict, it's an information battle as well. And as all of this unfolds, markets reacting, governments positioning, narratives forming, the pressure continues to build. Because the longer the situation remains unresolved, the greater the risk, the greater the cost, and the harder it becomes to step back from the edge. So now the question is no longer, what just happened? The question is, how far does this go? And to answer that, this has been building for years, decades even. What we are witnessing right now is not just a confrontation between Iran and the United States, it's a collision between systems. Let me explain what that means. For a long time, the global order has operated under a set of assumptions: open sea lanes, predictable trade routes, and a balance of power largely influenced by Western-led institutions and alliances. That system created stability, but it also created dependency. Dependency on specific routes, dependency on certain regions, dependency on the idea that no one would dare disrupt the flow at a scale that could hurt everyone, including themselves. But here's the problem. That assumption only works if everyone agrees to play by the same rules. And increasingly, that is no longer the case. Think about the broader shifts happening right now. Rising powers asserting influence, regional actors becoming more independent, economic blocs forming new alliances, trade routes being reconsidered. Countries like China are investing heavily in alternative infrastructure, ports, railways, pipelines, designed to reduce reliance on traditional choke points. Russia has been reshaping its energy strategy, redirecting flows and building new partnerships. Even within the Middle East, nations are exploring diversification in ways that would have seemed unlikely a decade ago. So when Iran makes a move like this, it's not happening in isolation. It's happening in a world that is already shifting. Let that sink in, because this is where the real significance lies. The closure of Hormuz isn't just a disruption, it's a signal that the old assumptions are being tested, a signal that leverage is being redefined, and a signal that the global system is more fragile than it appears. Now ask yourself this: if one choke point can create this level of disruption, what happens if others are tested? What happens if similar tensions emerge in other strategic locations? Suddenly, you're not looking at a single crisis, you're looking at a pattern. And patterns are what reshape history. But here is the part nobody is talking about. This moment also forces a deeper question about resilience. How resilient is the global economy? Really? How quickly can supply chains adapt? How effectively can countries coordinate responses? And perhaps most importantly, how much disruption can the system absorb before it starts to fracture? Because every crisis reveals weaknesses, and every weakness, once exposed, changes how future conflicts are approached. Think about that. This isn't just about what Iran did, it's about what the world learns from it, because those lessons will influence decisions long after this specific situation is resolved. And that brings us to the next phase of the story, the future, not just what might happen tomorrow. Because from this point forward, every decision matters, every signal matters, every move, whether visible or hidden, has the potential to push this situation toward resolution or toward escalation. Let's walk through the possibilities. First scenario, de-escalation. It's possible, very possible, that this situation stabilizes through back-channel negotiations, quiet diplomacy, pressure applied behind closed doors, incentives offered, compromises made. In this version of events, Iran eases restrictions, perhaps without publicly calling it a reversal. The United States continues its strategic approach, reducing reliance on the Strait of Hormuz while avoiding direct confrontation. Markets calm down, shipping resumes, and the world moves on, at least on the surface. But even in that scenario, something fundamental has changed, because once a red line is crossed, even temporarily, it's never quite the same again. Think about that. Now consider the second scenario. Prolonged tension. No full-scale conflict, but no real resolution either. A slow-burning crisis. Shipping remains inconsistent. Insurance costs stay high. Markets fluctuate with every new development. Governments remain on edge, constantly adjusting their strategies. In this scenario, the strait becomes a symbol of uncertainty, a place where risk is always present, even if it's not always visible. And over time, that uncertainty begins to reshape global behavior. Countries accelerate plans for alternative routes. Energy diversification becomes a top priority. Strategic reserves are expanded. In other words, the world starts preparing for a future where disruptions like this are not the exception, but the expectation. Let that sink in. Now the third scenario, escalation. And this is the one that keeps policymakers awake at night, because all it takes is one miscalculation, one incident at sea, one misinterpreted signal, one decision made under pressure, and suddenly, the situation spirals. Military assets move closer, tensions rise, lines are drawn more clearly, allies are forced to choose sides, and once that process begins, it becomes very difficult to stop, because escalation has its own momentum. Now ask yourself this: which of these scenarios is most likely? The truth is, it's not just about probability, it's about choices. Choices made in Washington, choices made in Tehran, choices made in capitals around the world. Because each decision shifts the trajectory, even if only slightly. And here is where things get even more complex. These choices are not being made in isolation. They are influenced by domestic politics, economic pressures, public opinion, historical grievances. Leaders are not just thinking about global strategy, they're thinking about their own positions, their own stability, their own future. And that makes every decision more complicated, more unpredictable, more consequential. So when you look at this situation, don't just think about ships and oil and geography. Think about human decisions. Because at the end of the day, that's what determines the outcome. And right now, those decisions are still being made. Not in speeches, but in reality. Because what just happened in the Strait of Hormuz wasn't just a disruption, it was a revelation. A revelation about vulnerability, a revelation about dependence, and most importantly, a revelation about control. Let me explain. For years, the global system has operated on the belief that stability, especially in critical trade routes, could be maintained through deterrence, alliances, and mutual interest. That belief has now been tested, and whether you agree with Iran's move or not, whether you support the response from the United States or question it, you cannot ignore what this moment has exposed. The system is not as secure as it looks. Think about that for a second. If one decision can trigger this level of global reaction, what does that say about the structure we rely on every single day? What does it say about supply chains that stretch across continents, about economies that depend on uninterrupted flow, about strategies built on assumptions that may no longer hold? Let that sink in, because this isn't just a geopolitical story, it's a wake-up call, a moment that forces governments, businesses, and even ordinary people to confront a difficult reality. Interconnection is power, but it is also risk, and the more interconnected the world becomes, the more sensitive it is to disruption. Now here's the part that really matters. What happens next isn't just about policy, it's about perception, because how this moment is interpreted by leaders, by markets, by the public, will shape the decisions that follow. If it is seen as a one-off crisis, the system may revert back to normal, at least temporarily. But if it is seen as a sign of deeper instability, then everything changes. Strategies shift, alliances evolve, priorities are rewritten, and slowly, almost quietly, a new version of the global order begins to take shape. Think about what that means. We could be witnessing a turning point. Not a loud, dramatic transformation, but a gradual, undeniable shift. The kind of shift that only becomes obvious in hindsight. The kind of shift where people look back and say, that's when things started to change. And that brings us to the final question. Not what Iran will do next, not what the United States will do next, but what the world will learn from this moment. Will it adapt? Will it reinforce the systems that have been tested? Or will it continue forward, hoping that the next disruption doesn't come too soon? Because one thing is clear, the rules are being challenged, the assumptions are being tested, and the balance is shifting. So the next time you hear about a distant waterway, a shipping lane, or an energy route, remember this moment. Remember how quickly everything changed, and ask yourself, if this is just the beginning, what comes next?